The European Refugee Crisis became widely publicised for the first time back in 2015 when the body of Alan Kurdi washed up on the shore near Bodrum, Turkey, in the early hours of Wednesday morning.
The little boy whose lifeless body was washed ashore now has a name. Aylan Kurdi was 3 years old when he lost his life crossing the Mediterranean Sea to Europe.
Alan was a small boy from Syria. His family was fleeing the civil war. Along with 12 others, Alan's family boarded a small boat in Bodrum and set out from an isolated beach late at night. The ship capsized 5 minutes after departure, killing Alan, his older brother, and his mother. They had been trying to reach the Greek island of Kos. Alan was just 3 years old. In this episode, we're going to focus on the meaning of this phrase, refugee crisis. When I hear that term, my first thought is the war in Syria, but even then, I can't exactly define what the refugee crisis actually is. I know that people are fleeing from war, many by boat, and are heading towards Europe, but then it all gets a little blurry. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one who struggles to pin down what exactly this term means. The irony of the situation, if there's any to be found, is just how often we hear this term. The refugee crisis has sort of become synonymous with the plethora of migrant issues the world now faces. So in this episode, we're going to break down this phrase, figure out what and who exactly is a refugee, and try to understand why someone would make the difficult decision to flee their home. This is Motion, a podcast about migration in the 21st century. A refugee crisis, in general, is the movement of a large group of displaced people. Getting more specific, the European Refugee Crisis describes the wider pattern of increased migration to Europe.
This summer has seen a huge movement of people across Europe, from Greece in the east to Calais in the west. All started their journeys outside the EU, or will end up claiming asylum in a European country.
The crisis reached a head in 2015, when more than 1 million refugees crossed into Europe, and countries began to struggle to cope with the influx. Going back to my original assumption that the refugee crisis was somehow tied to Syria, it's interesting to note that while it's true that Syrians made up nearly 50% of these new arrivals, refugees came from many different places. 6 of the 10 largest countries of origin of refugees were actually African, namely Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and Eritrea. So while I had most often associated the refugee crisis with the Middle East, it turns out that African countries are also tied up in it as well. Now, these people, these refugees, were fleeing their homes for a multitude of reasons, including violence, civil war, and the threat of persecution. But it's incorrect, and I think dangerous, to try and paint the refugee crisis in broad strokes. And by that, I mean trying to broadly explain for what reasons refugees were fleeing their home countries. So, in an attempt to avoid this, we're going to look at just one country today, Syria, and use the Syrian civil war as our case study. It was March 15th, 2011, when mass demonstrations began in Syria, when 15 schoolboys were arrested for spray painting anti-government slogans on a wall. These protests were a part of a greater response to political corruption. For decades, Arab populations had faced the oppression of free speech, human rights abuses, economic mismanagement, corruption, and a stifling of political dissent. For the people of the Middle East, justice and human dignity did not feel like priorities in most states. With these mass demonstrations, Syria joined a growing group of states as a revolutionary wave washed over the Arab world, known as Arabia al-Arabi, the Arab Spring. In some cases, the power struggle that ensued between civilians and their leaders did result in regime changes. In Egypt, President Hosni Mubarak was ousted. In Libya, following a civil war, the leader Gaddafi was killed. In Syria, however, what began as a civil uprising deteriorated into an armed rebellion and eventually a full-scale civil war that continues to this day. Since the conflict began, many new rebel groups have joined the fighting and have frequently fought one another. Not only that, now other countries have gotten involved through foreign backing and open intervention. As the war has gone on, growing more diffuse and complex, many international groups have essentially stopped tallying the war's death toll. By the United Nations' last count, back in 2016, 400,000 people had been killed.
Humanitarian organizations are struggling to care for Syrians escaping the attacks. This includes search and rescuers from the White Helmets organization.
Today, more than 5.6 million refugees have fled the country as refugees. To put that in terms I can explain, that's as if everyone from my home country, New Zealand, became refugees. And even with that, you'd still have 1 million people left over. I want to back up a second now. I've just spent this entire episode talking about the refugee crisis, but I haven't even defined what a refugee is. According to the UN, a refugee is any person forced to flee from their country because of violence or persecution for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. Now, that seems pretty clear-cut. If you're fleeing conflict or mistreatment, you're a refugee. The problem is, reality is more complex than that, and this definition turns out to not really work 100% of the time in practice. I pulled this definition from the 1951 Refugee Convention, which is considered the basic instrument of refugee protection. Now, this definition dates back half a century, and as a result, some would argue, myself included, that this definition is a bit outdated and unhelpful when applied to cases today. One huge problem with this definition is that it has fostered characteristics of asylum seekers as either political and thus deserving of refugee status, or economic and thus illegitimate. What I mean is that I think we view individuals fleeing political conflict differently from those fleeing economic hardship. Most asylum seekers, however, come from countries where economic failure and political instability are intrinsically linked. The Refugee Convention itself makes a pretty clear differentiation between people fleeing from persecution and people fleeing due to poverty and lack of opportunity. And as a result, much is made by governments of this supposed difference between people who genuinely need a safe place and those who merely, and I use that word in quotations, are in search of a better life. The term often used for these people searching for better job opportunities is economic migrants. Unlike refugees, these individuals do not cross borders for fear of persecution, but rather because the economic conditions in their home country might be so bad that they feel they have no choice but to leave and find a new life elsewhere.
I would not consider a lot of these people refugees because what they're doing is they're crossing a border and then they're going to try and cross another border to get to a better situation. It's an economic leap that they're making.
It's important to note that since economic migrants don't fall under the criteria for refugee status, they can't be afforded international protection. And it's in this tension between supposed voluntary and involuntary movement where I think a lot of the controversy around the refugee crisis lies. Picture this. You work as a clothes presser in Texas. you make about $20,000 a year, you have a family of 4 to provide for. The job market is tough enough as it is in America. Wage growth is sluggish. And then you find out that your government is allowing refugees into your country. Refugees who are able-bodied and just as capable of doing your job as you are. You're scared because you know that when the supply of able workers goes up, the price that employers have to pay to hire workers goes down. This was an argument made by American President Donald Trump. The question was, how will the least skilled Americans fare in the labour market when there is competition from immigrants?
Democrats don't care about the impact of uncontrolled migration on your communities, your schools, your hospitals, your jobs, or your safety.
According to Lord Richard Layard, Director of the Centre of Economic Performance at the London School of Economics, for the unskilled, immigration is a mixed blessing. It suppresses their wages and may affect their job opportunities. Already unskilled workers are 4 times more likely to be unemployed than skilled workers are, so it's not surprising that they worry. And then the question of support comes in. Refugees are entitled to the same economic and social rights of the citizens of the country they claim asylum in. They have a right to medical care, schooling, and the right to work. So then, the same American from Texas realizes that a portion of the money he earns goes towards the taxes that pay for these services for these people who have just shown up in his country. So, when you're faced with potentially depressed wages and unemployment, and then you hear that some of your money is going towards helping these people that you don't even know, well, maybe the last thing you might want is your country letting in more refugees. But let's put legalities aside for a moment and look inwards. For people in extreme hardship, whether that be poverty or political persecution, there exists an unthinkable decision. Leave behind your family, community, and country with no real clear idea of your final destination, or stay and risk persecution or even death. To leave one country for another is a traumatic decision to make. It can involve separation from family and loved ones, the need to learn a completely new language, and a loss of social status. I think the song lyric from Warren Shire's song, Home, is incredibly powerful. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark.
Home. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbors running faster than you, breath bloody in their throats. And the boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factories, holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you. Fire.
The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, or the UNHCR, declared 2015 to be a record year for refugees. It was estimated that approximately 1 in every 113 people were displaced worldwide. To put that into perspective, that means that for every minute of 2015, 24 people were forced to leave their homes. 2017 notably saw a decrease in global refugee numbers for the first time since 1997. However, I don't think this means the crisis is over. Even the naming of this phenomenon, the refugee crisis, I think is no longer applicable. The word crisis, after all, implies a temporary moment in time. But what we're seeing is a prolonged emergency, as countries fight with each other over where refugees should be relocated, who should take them in, and how much support should be given. And sometimes, countries decide to take this into their own hands. Next time on Motion, Asylum. You can find a full transcript of this podcast, along with a bibliography and links to reference articles on Motion's website. Motion's music is produced by Kevin MacLeod. Thank you to Sarah Pollock for designing Motion's graphics.